Welcome to Medmarc's webinar series. Today's presentation is titled Important Export Control Considerations for the Life Sciences Industry. I'm Kate Klaus, Senior Attorney in Medmarc's Risk Management Department. On behalf of Medmarc and today's presenter, Andrew Astuno, thank you for joining us. Andrew Astuno has a practice focused on U.S. export controls, international economic regulations, and anti-corruption. Andrew, a former policy advisor at the U.S. Treasury, specializes in conducting reviews for proposed foreign acquisitions in the United States before the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. He also advises U.S. and international clients in matters involving compliance with the Export Administration Regulations, International Traffic and Arms Regulations, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, and the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Andrew develops compliance procedures, conducts due diligence on transactions, performs internal investigations, and counsels clients through government enforcement actions. Andrew is a graduate of the University of Notre Dame and the University of Denver College of Law. With that, I am pleased to turn things over to Andrew.
Thank you, Kate, for that kind introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. As mentioned, Andrew Astuno is my name. I'm with the law firm Fluet. Fluet is a full-service law firm located in Tysons Corner, Virginia. While we have a very strong specialized background in national security issues and representing clients in the defense industries and other sensitive technologies, we also have a strong and broad capabilities as it relates to transaction matters, litigation, dispute resolution, and government contracts. So with that, I will soon begin my presentation, but I want to thank you all for attending. And as Kate mentioned, the purpose of this presentation today is to provide a high-level overview of export controls generally, how those are defined, how those are implemented and enforced by the U.S. government. And I will also try to, even though I'm not an expert like you are in your industry, the life sciences industry, I will try to tailor certain slides and certain aspects of my presentation to technologies such as vaccines or medical devices that come up in your day-to-day business. So at a high level, the U.S. government, generally speaking, regulates all shipments, all outbound transfers. So anytime an item, a good, a tangible item leaves the country, that falls under the jurisdiction, it falls under the authority of the U.S. government to regulate that outbound transfer. This, importantly, as I will address later, this also includes intangible property. So technical information, know-how, it's often referred to as. Think of drawings or intellectual property. That will also be regulated for export. And I say that now at a high level because I don't want clients, or I don't want the today's attendees to think that the export controls will only apply to something that you can physically touch and hold. In today's increasingly technologically sophisticated world, in fact, some of the most valuable property rights, some of the most valuable items that are exported are in fact intangible in nature. Generally speaking, exports are regulated by two regimes under U.S. laws. One of them is referred to as the ITAR, and the other is referred to as the EAR. I will mention at a high level that ITAR, those are regulations that are governed by the U.S. State Department and tend to cover military items, items that would be used in the context of war, and typically would not cover the types of technologies that your industry produces or manufactures. However, it is conceivable that if you're in your industry, if you were to provide a product or a service to a U.S. military component, then there could be an ITAR controlled issue. With that said, most of what I've discovered in preparation for this presentation, again, as it relates to medical devices and pharmaceuticals, are going to be covered by the EAR. So again, what is generally export compliance at a high level? Well, as you see in this slide here, the purpose of this is rooted in national security interests. The U.S. government has a very strong vested interest, and that interest in their willingness to enforce these rules only seems to grow over time. And that is to protect sensitive items. So whether it's items that pertain to U.S. Business advancements, the technological advantages, comparative advantages that the U.S. economy represents, or a military advantage that the U.S. military represents, those advantages, those technological breakthroughs that are achieved in this country, the U.S. government has a keen invested interest to ensure that that technology is not going to suddenly and quickly or feasibly leave a U.S. party's hands and go into a nefarious actor or an unintended buyer, an unintended end user. That essentially is at a high level the ultimate purpose for these types of regulations. As I mentioned earlier, ITAR, which typically will not apply to your industry. It is important to mention this, however, because these controls are the most stringent. Within the export field, within the controls and the regulations that are administered by the U.S. government, the ITAR regards the most sensitive items in nature. And again, you can think of defense articles, technical data, and defense services that have military applications. Generally, goods to be exported to your foreign customers, again, medical devices and or pharmaceuticals, are not controlled under the ITAR. The EAR, the less stringent book of regulations, is spelled out as the Export Administration Regulations. Now, the EAR is governed and administered by the Department of Commerce and an entity within the Department of Commerce called the Bureau of Industry and Security, BIS. Now, BIS is the counterparty that as an attorney, as a practitioner, that's my counterparty oftentimes, where I'm going to BIS asking for licenses, asking for what's called export classification numbers. If there's a question that comes up as to whether particular approval is required, or if a client happened to send something out without getting prior approval and an issue comes up, BIS is the party that I'm dealing with in those occasions. As I may have mentioned earlier, there's this concept of dual use items. Now that refers to items that have both military and commercial application. And this comes up rather frequently, especially when in today's day and age, when you have items that are rather adaptable in nature and they're designed for a broad customer base. So when that comes up, when you have what's called a dual use item, that will be identified on the Commerce Control List. And the Commerce Control List, also known as the CCL, it's divided up into numerous categories. And within those categories, it's further divided up into numerous product groups. Now, it is quite possible that items that are produced within your industry and by your industry would appear somewhere on the CCL. And in order to confirm that analysis, however, or to confirm that understanding, an export classification analysis needs to be conducted. And there's a couple slides coming up that pertain to that. So at a high level, when you see something like this, when you see this list, it's okay to not know exactly whether your item or your proposed item, maybe something is in development, where that falls and how that might be covered by the CCL. The main thing to understand, I think one of the biggest takeaways from today, hopefully, is that when in doubt, if not always, go out and have an export classification analysis be conducted so that you know exactly how your item is treated under the regulations. There's an important, sometimes referred to as a catch-all designation, and that is EAR 99. If an item falls under the jurisdiction of BIS, but is not listed on the CCL, then it is designated as EAR 99. Importantly, this means that these items typically do not require advance approval, in other words, a license, an official export license, prior to their outbound shipment. However, that does not mean that if your item is EAR 99, you can simply export without any concern. And that is because there's other regulations, there's other regimes that are very important and that can come up as it relates to who your customer is and who your end user might be. Or if it's not your customer, perhaps your customer's customer, if you have knowledge as to whether, in fact, your customer will be reselling or retransferring the item that is being exported. Those regulations tend to be administered by OFAC, which is the body within the U.S. Treasury Department that enforces and administers U.S. sanctions rules and U.S. sanctions compliance rules, as well as BIS. They put out what's called an entity list, and I'll get to that in a final slide. But the takeaway here is that even if your item is EAR 99, which perhaps, if not likely, many of the items within the life sciences industry are, there still are other regimes and other regulations that should be understood. This slide here, what constitutes technology under the EAR? I think the biggest takeaway is that technology does not necessarily need to be something that's tangible, that you can physically touch and hold. Increasingly, technology comes in the form of what's known as technical information, and the information that underlies the development of the actual tangible item. This slide stands to then showcase, to illustrate how technical information is treated as technology and is controlled just the same as the ultimate end product. There's a note here, which I believe it's important for me to restate, but that is, again, including intangible items in the form of blueprints, drawings, photographs, plans, diagrams, models, formulas, etc. So to finish this portion of the presentation, some key takeaways are that if your item indeed is not ITAR controlled, the next question is whether it is EAR controlled. Even if it is EAR 99, there still could be regulatory issues to contend with based on who the end user is or the end destination. Countries that appear in the news that have adverse interests to the US, those countries tend to be the ones where more caution should be exercised for reasons that you can understand. But still, we always caution clients to conduct an official assessment, to have an export compliance policy in place, to perhaps even have an internal officer that oversees and that verifies and confirms any export prior to it occurring. So I will now talk about, going back to what I mentioned, when we looked at the list of categories and the list of subcategories under the CCL, how do we know where we stand, right? How do we know exactly where the item falls on that list? And the only way to know for sure is to obtain what's called an ECCN, an export classification number. There are three ways to obtain an ECCN. One would be to contact the manufacturer. Perhaps this is an item that your company bought prior to you then using the item, enhancing the item, integrating that item into another product that you're developing. And the manufacturer, so your counterparty in that situation, should understand what the ECCN is. And perhaps as a matter of good practice, it would be wise to confirm the ECCN prior to your original acceptance of that product, just so you know what you hold, whether you hold something that is sensitive in nature, something that might require the need for an export license down the road. Number two is a self-classification process. We counsel our clients. Typically, this is not perhaps it certainly is a riskier course of action in the sense that you may have someone who's not formally trained in this process looking at these regulations for the first time, trying to determine what the actual classification number might be. With that said, if proper training protocols are in place, and if a compliance manual, for example, has been implemented and agreed to at the company level, then there are many examples where that's quite fine, where we've seen a company have an export compliance officer, a division within the risk management department of your particular company that's very capable and sophisticated to conduct these types of assessments. But as a starting point, we'd always recommend linking up and involving someone such as our office to prepare a compliance strategy and a compliance protocol to ensure that these classifications are occurring pursuant to best practices. Or number three, to determine this number, you may submit an official commodity classification request to BIS's online platform known as SNAP-R. And this might take some time. In our experience, it's not a matter of too many months, but typically 30 days is a minimum is to be expected before you will receive your official classification number. This slide here pertains to the fundamental reasons for why an item is controlled, and this will then ultimately relate to whether a license is indeed required. There are multilateral controls, and those are the results of diplomatic initiatives that the US government has agreed to and engaged with other countries, where pursuant to a treaty, for example, or an agreement among multiple countries, a multilateral group have agreed to control the export of certain items. Whereas there's other reasons for control known as unilateral controls, and that is where the US government on its own, unilaterally as the word implies, has enforced certain controls without any sort of diplomacy or without any other engagement with other countries. The reasons for these controls are ultimately they're codified as symbols, as acronyms, as appearing in the Commerce Control List. And that acronym, that symbol, will then go into the analysis as to whether an export license is required to your particular customer or end user. Okay, so for purposes of your industry, I've attempted to extract certain examples as I could tell from across the regulations where certain items are indeed controlled and may require an export license. These include biological agents and genetic elements, vaccines, biological processing equipment, technology, which again includes technical information underlying said technology, information that may be shared with a foreign worker in your US facility. These are an interesting set of what's called deemed export rules, which I will get to in a bit, or ultimately the re-export of a US item that originally came from a foreign country. Key questions to determine if a license is needed. So going back to the importance of knowing how your item exactly is classified, what would be the classification number that applies to it? That is always the starting point. And recall that it's important to perhaps involve outside counsel or someone who is experienced in this matter, so as you can go through and you can navigate these rules as efficiently as possible. In most cases, if the item is EAR 99, that would mean that an export license is not required. However, the analysis is dependent on where the item is going, its destination country, who the recipient is, and where they reside. Another question regards the type of end use. Even if the item is going to a less restricted country, a destination, if its end use is not deemed to be reasonable, that also would trigger the requirement for a license. Examples of prohibited end use, or in fact, it's prohibited outright, meaning that a license is not even available. Examples of such prohibited end use include restrictions on certain nuclear end uses, use of products and weapons of mass destruction, and use of microprocessors for military end use. Again, with respect to your particular industry, I extrapolated certain items. I reviewed the CCL, and I understand that the following items here are not controlled. Again, that is only with regard to export controls. There are other regimes that should be, of course, you should be wary of as it relates to sanctions compliance in particular. And I have some slides at the end of this presentation that pertain to that. Several of these items, as you can see here, protein sequencing apparatuses, peptide synthesis, DNA sequencing technologies, and other consumer or medical protective gear. Other items that we've determined are generally not controlled include pathogens or toxins that, unless they are indeed listed on the CCL, gene fragments, E. coli, nucleic acid sequences, and other technical items that are related to these categories. Again, this is a reminder that technology takes the form of technical data or technical assistance underlying the ultimate end product. Source code, for example, or engineering drawings, these again come to mind. There are some important exceptions to the EAR where, given that the product, the intellectual property, may already be out in the public, that means it's not as regulated. It's not subject to the EAR as other items would be. Examples of this include publicly available technology and software. So if I just get on Google and I type in the given item or technology that your company intends to export, if I'm able to publicly access that same information, then that would mean typically that it's not going to be controlled for export. Another example of that is in some information that's already appearing in a journal, for example, a peer-reviewed journal or an industry newsletter that's already been out available to the public. There's another exception here known as arising during fundamental research that comes up often in an educational context where, for example, a medical school that's analyzing certain data as it relates to vaccines or biological pathogens, or chemicals, it produces some report assessing its information that, in this educational context, that means it likely would not be subject to the EAR. Finally, information that's included in certain patent applications, given its public profile, that will likely also mean it's no longer regulated. As I mentioned earlier, it is possible to have an export without the given item, without the given technology or technical information leaving the country. This comes up in particular when a foreign national is at your US laboratory, for example, your US facility, and protected proprietary information not falling under one of the exceptions that I just mentioned is being shared with said foreign national. That constitutes an export, a deemed export. I think this is kind of interesting and perhaps it's overlooked. So we always caution our clients that certain protocols and certain policies need to be put into place if indeed it's a common practice or if it's even foreseeable whatsoever for your client to invite a foreign national or to collaborate with a foreign national at some point here onshore in the US. So these rules are very important and perhaps often overlooked. I understand, I was talking to the Medmarc folks prior to this presentation, and I understand that a lot of your customers in this industry are in Europe, in the EU. And I took the time then to evaluate, at least at a high level, some of the regulatory issues that come up with as it relates to the export of medical devices to the EU. I found this interesting, but the US, across the entire US economy, there have been exports of over $20 billion in medical devices as of 2018. representing 38% of the total export market. The pharmaceutical sector alone accounted for 36 billion. Those numbers are quite significant. It makes me find it interesting to be even more interesting. And obviously, there's a huge demand in the EU. With that said, the compliance requirements also tend to be rather stringent. While the EU does not have the equivalent of the FDA that we have here in the US, there are certain requirements as it relates to, again, these are all in addition, supplementing the BIS requirements that relate to what's called a conformity assessment to ensure that the medical device meets legal requirements, local requirements as it relates to safety. This second slide, again, outlines a few more of the specific rules that pertain to the conformity assessment across the various member states in the EU. As I understand it, the EU member states individually have accredited notified bodies to conform said assessments, and these bodies differ from one state to another. So, putting these together, the ITAR rules and the EAR rules that were just discussed, generally speaking, unless an exclusion or an exemption applies, a U.S. person meaning also a corporate entity, must obtain an export authorization from the U.S. government, typically that would be BIS, under the Department of Commerce, before exporting any ITAR-controlled defense articles, CCL-controlled items, technical data, defense services, or technology. And again, another reminder that technology includes intangible property, intangible intellectual property. This authorization comes in the form of a license. This is a routine area of our practice, by the way, is to apply for a BIS license when indeed one is required. A note here that under the EAR, the precise destination of an export will invariably determine whether a license is required. For instance, if the end user is in Russia, that will most likely affect the analysis compared to whether the end user might be in a country that is a strong ally of the US, such as the United Kingdom. As these restrictions vary from country to country, it's important to note that the list and the restrictions, the rules, they are politically influenced in nature, which makes it more dynamic. It makes it certainly less predictable, as political trends and national security issues tend to change very quickly. All of this is to say that the need and the priority to involve outside expertise to build an internal compliance program is all the more important. As you might be able to understand, again, the most restricted destinations tend to be those countries that are known adversaries to the United States or have been officially embargoed. This slide, again, highlights whether indeed an export is occurring. An actual shipment, obviously, constitutes an export. But again, it's important to understand here that performing a service without actually shipping a tangible item, that also may constitute an export. Finally, I'll mention again here the deemed export example that we talked about a few minutes ago. If the transfer of information or technical know-how is being transferred from a U.S. employee to a foreign national, it could be a consultant, it could be also an employee here in the U.S., that would be a deemed export again. Okay, so if indeed a license is required, under the ITAR, which refers to, again, the more stringent, the more restricted items, there are several types of licenses available. I won't spend too much time on this slide, given that for your industry, it's deemed that most products are not covered under the USML, which is the list of items controlled by the ITAR most prominently. But I think it is important to understand that the type of license will depend on whether you are a manufacturer or you're the likes of a distributor or perhaps even a broker. And that is, another takeaway here is that even if you're not the manufacturer of the item, but you're involved in the transaction between the buyer and the seller, the manufacturer and the end user, your role, that of a broker, could therefore require you to seek a license. While some limited exceptions apply for foreign trade shows and demonstrations, which I'm sure your industry is well accustomed to attending, in most instances, a license is required at U.S. trade shows and demonstrations. This is, I think, is again another example. It's a way to showcase the fact that any transfer of proprietary technical information, the U.S. government is very keen to understand what exactly is being transferred and to who it's going. So that portion of the presentation concludes the high-level overview of exports and export controls. I would next like to address, in our remaining time, some other regulatory bodies that you should also be wary of. The first is known as the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, or FCPA. This regime essentially governs, and it pertains to interactions that your company may have with foreign government representatives. It's rooted in the desire to prevent any sort of corrupt behavior, any sort of business activities that result from the likes of a bribe, some non-transparent economic payments, or some arrangement that is contrary to what the likes of shareholders have agreed to what the commercial agreement may indeed state. It basically polices any sort of informal corrupt behavior that occurs, again, between the company level and a foreign government representative. All U.S. persons are subject to the FCPA. Persons, again, is defined broadly to mean any U.S. entity. It's interesting that non-U.S. citizens are also subject to the FCPA under certain circumstances, including if they work for a U.S. company, if they engage in any furtherance of the corrupt payment while working at the U.S. company or residing in a U.S. territory, or if they assisted a U.S. entity or individual with the actual informal illicit transaction. So in the context of acting as an agent. Some high-level concepts here. A foreign official can include not necessarily an elected official. So an employee of a state-owned business, for example, that person, you might think, well, they just have a regular job in business or industry as anyone else might. But given the fact that they're employed by a state-owned entity, that indeed would make any sort of illicit transaction with that person subject to the FCPA. Payments also do not need to be direct. If for instance, that the payment ultimately will go to a government representative, but you only have direct knowledge or direct experience in seeing the payment go to an intermediary person or entity prior, that does not excuse you. That does not mean that you're no longer liable under the FCPA. Payments do not also need to include cash. They can include gifts, items of value. Finally, I think it's important to understand that aside, again, from the export regime and the FCPA regime, there also is a very important set of regulations and rules that pertain to sanctions compliance. These rules are administered and enforced by the Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, which is an entity within the U.S. Department of Treasury. Essentially, the purpose of OFAC, their central mission, is to prevent any sort of transactions occurring with listed or designated individuals or entities. One may be listed for a variety of reasons, Typically, it comes up in the context of known behavior that is significantly adverse to the interests of the U.S. Actors that pose national security threats to the U.S., or actors that are committing known crimes or activities that are overwhelmingly against the interests of the U.S. The SDN list will include known terrorists, for instance, but it will also include companies that or individuals that are executives or major shareholders of companies that have been known to engage in corrupt activities. The objective, again, at a high level, is to economically isolate these entities or individuals by prohibiting them from having access to the U.S. markets. This will also come up in terms of financial transactions. So if there's any flow of money that at one point would hit a U.S. clearinghouse, a U.S. financial institution, that entity that may have sent out some funds, for instance, to transfer to another entity, if those funds and that entity is listed, they're on the U.S. sanctions list. If those funds at any point in time hit a U.S. intermediary financial institution, that institution likely will have a requirement and obligation to freeze those assets. It's not uncommon for a lot of transfers to be frozen, and at which point then certain licenses and applications need to be made to OFAC for those funds to be unfrozen. This slide, OFAC's SDN list, specially designated nationals. Again, it reflects some of the core issues and some of the known activities that will result in an individual being placed on such list. Generally speaking, these individuals, if they are indeed listed, are persona non grata, so to speak, from a U.S. economic standpoint. And we counsel our clients for good measure, even if you have no reason to think otherwise, for good practices, best practices, is to run a search. Any known end user or customer, especially a customer that you haven't dealt with before, to run their name, including their shareholders, their executives, to do a quick due diligence check. Take out the word quick, to do a proper, appropriate due diligence check to ensure that there is no issues, that there is no violation of the OFAC rules. Recently, especially with activities that are occurring in Russia and Ukraine, there have been an increasing amount of sanctions programs, particularly as it relates to foreign financial institutions. The example that I just mentioned, where you could have a transfer, you could have a wire transfer from a bank in Moscow to, say, a bank in Dubai. There's no obvious U.S. connection. But if a U.S. bank, perhaps even unbeknownst to the party that is wiring the funds out of Russia, if a U.S. intermediary financial institution holds on to that money for even a split second in time, becomes involved in the transaction, which actually is a common occurrence for banks to act as intermediaries, then suddenly that transfer is subject to the OFAC rules, and the funds very well may be frozen. I've personally worked on several examples, several incidents where I would say perfectly innocent individuals, not designated for sanction, have transferred money out of Russia in particular, and suddenly have found that their funds are frozen in a New York City bank account. These are some other lists for your own perusal and your own awareness. Again, highlighting that the sanction programs are growing in nature, and the U.S. government on the whole is enforcing and ramping up its regulatory prowess. Another reminder here is that even if an export license is not required, going back to our discussion under the EAR, it's important to conduct a search. This goes into the overall due diligence nature of your work to ensure that your customer, the end user, or your customer's customer, if known, is not on one of the following lists: the denied persons list, or the denied parties list, the unverified list. This list indicates that the party, while it's not on the denied parties list, there is inadequate or insufficient information to suggest that a license would not be required. So therefore, a license exception would not apply to any party that's on the unverified list. The entity list, that list stands for an outright prohibition, similar to the SDN list as it relates to sanctions. And on the Department of State, there's also several lists, including the AECA debarred list, which is comprised of entities and individuals that have been prohibited by the State Department from participating directly or indirectly in the export of defense articles. In summary, and I think a very important way to end my presentation is to emphasize again the importance of compliance strategies, of having a suitable and a comprehensive internal policy in place such that your company understands the requirements. Number two, understands the consequences of noncompliance. But number three, and most importantly, has plans in place, has protocols and procedures in place to ensure that compliance will be adhered to at all times. And on the front end, perhaps this does involve a bit of work, some trainings. It certainly is an investment, but down the road, in terms of a future return, we have found that clients are very happy that once a suitable compliance program is in place, this leads to efficiencies in the long run. It leads to fewer questions, fewer concerns as to whether a particular export or a particular activity with a foreign actor, a foreign customer, a foreign party is indeed prohibited or not. And ultimately, it creates a more fluid business environment. So with that said, I will again mention that one of our core functions as an international trade team here at Fluet is to develop suitable compliance strategies for our clients. This slide here gives you my contact information, and I also would mention that my colleagues, Adam Munitz, partner here, Rachel Hess, National Security Specialist, have been very helpful towards me in the preparation of this presentation. And we would be happy to assist you going forward as it relates to any questions for your industry with respect to export controls, sanctions compliance, and related due diligence. And with that said, I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you so much for your attendance.
Andrew, thank you so much. That was very helpful. I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about some specific issues that companies in this space might face. I'm thinking about maybe a US producer of a product. It is not approved in the United States, but it is being sent overseas for clinical trials. What concerns might they have in exporting that type of for investigational use only product?
Sure, and that's a good question. And there are many exceptions to the rules in general, such that, well, if for a limited purpose, if the product is going to leave the country for a limited or specialized purpose, a license may not be required. With that said, we did a check on this actually just this morning. We are not aware of any clinical trial exception. And so as just a matter of good general practice, I think companies, your insureds, should know that anytime an item is being contemplated or proposed for export, whether it's for a limited clinical trial or whether the final product is being sold, in large quantities and volumes, regardless of the context, a full assessment should be done to understand if indeed a license is required.
Good to know, especially where we see a lot of clinical trial companies. They often tend to be startups. So, helping them get a grasp on what exactly they don't know is a really important function that we take on here. Another topic that I thought would have really caught the attention of our listeners was with regard to BIS licensing for the potential export of intellectual property through human interaction. Medical devices in general, life sciences, it's really a global industry. So we frequently see interaction with foreign nationals. It can be sort of like an OEM CMO relationship where you possess technology and you're manufacturing it for someone, or you're contracting out the manufacture of it. Or, if you have a global parent company, maybe you're interacting regularly with foreign nationals who are part of the same organization. What kind of lines are drawn? Where is licensure required?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a really good point, and especially as you said, and it's my understanding too that life sciences, it tends to be a worldwide collaborative process. The genome of a U.S. citizen is the same as a national anywhere else in the world. The medical needs of one country are the same as another. So I can appreciate that, given how worldly and collaborative the industry and the research and the training must be across the life sciences industry. That means that the likelihood of a deemed export is much higher. And again, as we talked about, a deemed export can happen even within the U.S. There is not an actual transfer. There's not an email that's necessarily sent to someone who's sitting in a foreign office. There's not a shipment of any product. There's not even a phone call out of the country. You're sitting next to a foreign national, and you're in the same laboratory. You're in the same office, and that definitely, I think it can catch companies off guard, and for good reason. It's hard to at first think, well, why would this be an export if it's all happening in the same room here in the U.S. But at a high level, and I think how I would frame my answer to that question is, we need to know what the item is, and maybe there's multiple items, but in that type of collaborative process where there could be an exchange of information, not proprietary information, we need to know, well, what are the items, what are the classification numbers of the technologies and the technical information that is being shared. And again, it very well could be more than one item. It could be more than one piece of technical information, and you could have two pieces of technical information that are classified differently. One has a classification number of X, the other has a classification number of Y, and perhaps a license is required for one and not the other. So I think at a high level, some big takeaways here is that collaboration across the world, of course, that's a great thing, and it makes total sense for your industry. But prior to that collaboration, prior to any information sharing, it is incumbent upon the U.S. company to know what it holds, how it's classified, how it's characterized, and two, to then understand what sort of compliance requirements may exist prior to that sharing.
And I think understanding in this industry, it may not be front of mind to consider this type of licensure. So in the event that a company has a misstep, they do not get the licensure they require prior to some type of export of material or information, and they are hit with some sort of investigation. What are their best first steps?
That's a great question. And, a lot of responsible and diligent, successful companies have found themselves in that position. So it doesn't mean that if you are in that position that, you've committed some grave, irreversible error. With that said, getting ahead of it, so to speak, being transparent, being proactive is always the best course of action. We oftentimes represent our clients in making what are known as voluntary disclosures. So bringing the issue to the regulator before the regulator brings the issue to you. That is always, in my experience, the best course of action. If it's too late, if you already have the equivalent of a notice or a penalty, or even just questions that you need to respond to, of course, it's very, I think, prudent at that time to involve outside counsel to have formal representation, to try to navigate whatever sort of punitive measures, whatever remedial process is about to come about. I will say again that having a compliance policy in place, having a compliance strategy in place is a really useful document to refer to in that type of situation. So you can show the US government that you've already attempted to think about these things and that your compliance, it is important to you. And this isn't the first time that you're learning about exports is when you get perhaps that letter or that phone call that you don't want to get. But again, you've already done some baseline efforts to create an environment of compliance.
That's very helpful. Thank you. And I think we are coming up on the hour, so we will leave it at that. Thank you so much for your time today, Andrew. Your expertise is absolutely going to be of value to our audience.
I hope so. I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you to all the attendees. And these are technical concepts, very dense information. So please do not expect to have mastered or to have a full understanding of these concepts within 1 hour. But if there's any other follow-up questions or observations or comments, I welcome your contact, and I hope that I may be of service to your industry going forward.